Alright guys, in this particular lecture, we're going to talk about the pre-contact conditions in Europe. I'm not actually going to have my webcam going on this one. I want to test out and see what you guys prefer, and we also have a lot of images that I want you to see, so that's the reason why you won't actually be seeing my face on this one. Alright, so we've got a couple of essential questions to talk about. What you should be able to understand by the time you walk away from this particular lecture is what changes were going on in Europe prior to exploration, and we want to look at how these changes might motivate people to begin to explore for a new world. Because this particular segment is so complicated, I wanted to give you a preview of what we're about to talk about. There are four main things that you need to be aware of going into this particular lecture. The 15th century is a time of radical change in Europe. They've been through a lot. Things are very unstable for them. They've had just the century, or the, like 100 years before, they had plagues and famine, and so things have been shifting. At the beginning, around about the beginning of the 15th century or the 1400s, we see the Renaissance roll in. And the Renaissance is changing the fabric of society in both positive and negative ways. We're going to look at some of those here in a second. The monarchs in Europe are looking for ways to maximize their empire and thus their financial reserves. Europeans begin to work on maximizing their profits. And this is the point in time in which the Catholic Church is confronted and religion begins to splinter into what's known as the Protestant Reformation. So that's where we're headed. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to have you choose a person before we go into this actual lecture. So you've got four groups of people here, and I want you to look at all of them and kind of determine who do you want to play for this particular lecture. Do you have one in mind? Okay, here we go. Watch for your person. We're actually going to start with the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is preceded by the Dark Ages. And what we see with the Dark Ages is that it directly follows the fall of the Roman Empire. And it's called the Dark Ages because if you look at the Roman Empire, there's lots of innovation, lots of knowledge, and that is considered the light portion. When that knowledge and innovation is lost, society becomes dark. It's culturally and economically unstable for many, many, many years. And so what you see in this particular image, you've got basically throughout the Dark Ages, your nobility, your fighters or your knights, and you've got your peasants that do all the work. And that's about it for life. With the Renaissance, which follows up on the Dark Ages, some of these ancient texts are rediscovered. And so light starts to come back into the European society. So we find ancient texts in philosophy, medicine, architecture. We've got science, geography. Here's some art, some Da Vinci. So you've got knowledge about anatomy. This is the time in which Galileo starts to become really, really popular in science. Here's an image of some famous Renaissance architecture. And of course, you can't forget the art. So what the Renaissance does is that it's an outlet for Europeans. At a time where their society is fragmented and they don't know what to expect, this academic and artistic discovery gives them an opportunity to give control for certain aspects of their world. Rather than living in fear and not knowing why things happen, science gives them an opportunity to understand the way the world works. The developments that you see in the Renaissance, and we're going to talk about this here in a minute, will greatly contribute to the ability of Europeans to begin to explore. And actually, I think we may not hit on that one in this particular lecture, but in one of the ones that are coming. So let's talk about what life was like in Europe in the 1400s. If you chose this guy, you're a peasant, and I'm naming you John. What we find is that most Europeans, about 75% of society, were peasants. They live in very stressful and poor conditions for most of their lives, and many of them live as rural farmers. They experience frequent high taxation. They pay rent for the land they farm and many, many other fees for that land to landlords. And they also have to pay money to the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church is reigning at this point in time. So all of these taxes and fees drive many of them to starvation regularly. Even in normal times, their diet's pretty poor. And most of their lives are consisting of just constant strenuous labor until they die. There's not much opportunity to get out of this pit, by the way. If you're born into peasant life, that's pretty much how your life is going to be. You're not going to magically turn into a noble. That is not going to happen for you. Most peasant families cooperatively farmed and raised livestock on land that they owned with others called commons. And so that's kind of what you see here. Now, things start to change population-wise in Europe, and this is really, really important. Over the course of about 50 years, from about 1450, you have 55 million people, to 1500, you have 100 million people in Europe. So the population doubles almost in the span of about 50 years. This is a pretty big deal. More people means more demand. More demand for land, wood, which is basically your fuel at this point in time, and food. So here's the thing. With an extra around about 50 million people hanging around, you're not going to have more land to farm. You're not going to see an increase in your forests and your natural resources, and you're not going to have more food. What's going to result from this is that you're going to see an increase in famine because you're going to have more people eating more of the food. The crops aren't going to keep up. What also makes things a little bit worse at this time is that the environmental conditions get a little icky. And so they have a mini ice age around about this time, and it causes frequently poor crops. So you've got additional famine. So not only are you not producing enough food for the 55 million people that were living in Europe, the extra 50 million mouths you have to feed, you are not going to be able to feed because of this environmental condition. Well, you think if I can't farm it, maybe I can hunt it. Well, here's the other problem. If you're using wood for fuel, and you've got an extra 50 million people hanging around, you're going to experience mass deforestation, and that's actually what happened. Europe's pretty cold in the winter. And so more people means more use of wood, fewer trees. Nobody's going out and planting new trees to keep up with the usage at this time. So if you have fewer trees, what you end up getting is a shortage of wild game, and so you additionally have a loss of food supply there. So if you can't farm, you can't find land to farm because all of a sudden land has become more valuable because of the demand. The nobles are wanting to enclose their commons land, make it private, so peasants are going to be basically homeless during this time. They're losing everything that they've got. They have no food. They've got to make some decisions. So here's the thing. So let's say they go to the city, and you kind of see a nice town view here, and you think, well, the city will change my fortunes. You see a mass exodus of peasants going to the towns and cities. Most of these towns were pretty small, with the exception of London. Many of them are very dirty and disease-filled. So if you've ever seen the movie Sweeney Todd, you know the opening scene where they're coming into the harbor, they're coming into London, and everything's dark and smoggy and dirty. That's kind of what I think of when I think of London in the 1400s. Cities are not great places to be. Even after you relocate, the new arrivals to town are at the bottom of the social ladder. If they could even find a job, it's a basic servant or a laborer, and they're going to continue to remain impoverished the rest of their lives. Like I said, if you're born as a peasant or you're born in the lower ranks of society, you're never climbing that ladder. It's not like the United States today. Things are going to remain miserable for you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about politics and economics. There's some interesting things going on here. So if you chose either of these two folks, this is Christopher Columbus, and you've got some monarchs during this time, the Spanish monarchs. So here's what's starting to happen. Let me go backwards really quickly. Monarchs from different countries are starting to try to expand their empires through marriage. So for instance, if I'm in Spain and I'm queen there, if I marry the king from England, we're going to merge our assets, okay? So not only are we married socially, but my finances become your finances. And this is how European monarchs begin to build more profit, more power. They also begin to lessen their dependency on the nobility class. They begin to turn to merchants to help them build profits. Now, what we see going on economically is very interesting. Originally, Europe was based in the same principle as the Native Americans, that principle of reciprocity. So they might use money in Europe before we see this change start to occur, but it's pretty strictly regulated. And so socially, people are expected to ensure reasonable prices. You might make some profit, but it's completely unacceptable to make such a profit that you are seen as excessive or exploitative. This changes in the 1400s and 1500s. The new name of the game is to make as much money as you possibly can. The biggest profit as is possible. So what we start to see in Europe at this time is they're moving from a non-market economy towards a market economy or towards capitalism. As a consequence of that, we see the rise of joint stock companies, or basically corporations. They sell stock to investors and they use that money to run their businesses. This will play a role in the development of colonies as we talk about them next week. So I'm a business owner, I'm a merchant. My role is to make as much money as is possible. And generally, I'm pretty successful at that. So you've got peasants that are running to the cities and they remain poor, whereas the nobility and the merchant class are increasing their profits. So we see a huge widening gap between the rich and the poor. And there's not really any way to get out of it. I believe this is the last section. And we're going to talk about religion. This is a really, really, really big one as well. What you see during this time, if you've picked this guy, congratulations, you're Martin Luther. In the 1400s and before, Western and Central Europe is dominated by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has almost as much power, if not more, than the monarchy. Okay, they're very, very powerful. During the 1500s, as the Renaissance is emerging and people are having more control over their lives and the world they live in, there starts to be conflict with the Catholic Church. And they come under fire during the 1500s for two major practices. The first is the role that priests play. They act as kind of an intermediary between the common man and God. Only priests were allowed to deliver the sacraments, And they were considered the only people who were able to communicate with God. So they have a direct line to God. Nobody else does. It's not like people today who pray to God regularly. In 1400 Europe, God is not hearing you. The priest has to communicate to God for you and receive communication. The Bibles were written in Latin, so unless you were involved with the church, you're not reading that Bible. So the priests and those involved in the Catholic Church have complete control over the Word of God. The other thing that is a huge problem is the sale of indulgences, and you probably heard of this. So the idea is, I'm a member of the church and I commit a sin. I have to go participate in confession and receive a penance. So I have to do some kind of exercise or good work in order to repent for that sin, to make up for it. Now, after death, I'm going to spend some time in purgatory, which is kind of like an afterworld waiting room, similar to what you have in the doctor's office. I'm going to hang out in purgatory for a while to make up for these sins. What the Catholic Church started doing, oh, and let me back up a little bit. I'm going to hang out in purgatory even if I atone for these sins with my repentance. So my good works or my devotional exercises that help me make up for it. I've still got to go to purgatory. So the church comes up with an idea. They begin to sell what's called indulgences to the public that was believed to cancel out both their penance or punishment for the sin and purgatory time. So basically, I can go commit a sin and go to the Catholic Church, purchase an indulgence, and I don't have to do any of that good work stuff or spend any time in purgatory for it. I've got a clean slate. So the sale of indulgences becomes wildly popular by the 1500s. And the church would start to grant an indulgence for doing simple things like somebody donating money to the church. So it starts to lose some of its reliability. So you remember our buddy Martin Luther. He's a German monk, and in 1517 he decides he's got a huge issue with the Catholic Church. And he starts to complain. He writes these complaints up in a document known as the 95 Theses, which you see on the right. And he nails them to the church door, for which he's actually excommunicated thereafter. Luther argues two main things, and these things define what are known as Protestants thereafter when the Catholic Church splits. Luther believed that God alone granted salvation as a reward for faith and not just for good acts. He also believed that every person had a personal responsibility for their own spirituality and morality. So this meant that Bibles needed to be translated. And so this is an example of Martin Luther's own translation from Latin, I believe, into German of the Bible. And this results in a push towards literacy and the education of common people. Now, what's interesting is the printing press has just been invented. And so, as a consequence of the Renaissance. So this also makes Bibles a little more easily put into the hands of the regular man. This is the room that Martin Luther actually wrote his Bible. It's kind of cool. Now, England has their own Reformation, which we'll talk about probably next week. If you guys recognize this person, this is Henry VIII. And his own version of the Protestant Reformation comes out of a desire for divorce and a hope for a male heir instead of a lot of females running around the house. The other version of Protestantism that we're really concerned about at this point is known as the Puritans, and they subscribe to this guy, John Calvin's doctrine of predestination. They believed that your spiritual future was already predetermined by God and that you couldn't change your own fate. So here's the thing. I'm either predestined for heaven or I'm not. And if I'm not, there's nothing I can ever do to change that. So if you've got a whole group of Puritans hanging around Europe, and they believe that everyone else is going to hell and there's nothing they can do about it. And just for example, here's some of these famous folks that will be in the Americas here pretty soon. So I'm running around telling everyone else they're going to hell. We've got a problem. People aren't going to like me. So keep that in mind as we get ready to talk about colonization. Okay, so let's quickly recap. I know this was a long one. Remember that Renaissance has changed the fabric of society in both positive and negative ways. It's made new thoughts and new innovations possible. Monarchs are trying to make money and make their empires as big as is possible. Europeans are becoming capitalists and they want to make maximum profits as well. And the Catholic Church has been confronted. The Protestant Reformation has begun, and religion is splintering, including a group who believes that most everyone else is going to hell. So let me ask you this. This is our last slide. I want you to make a prediction with what you saw about the Americas in mind. Based on what you know regarding the conditions of Europe, what groups do you think would be interested in coming to the New World, and why? That'll do it for this particular lecture. We will probably have one more this week on Christopher Columbus. You guys have a great week.